In the heart of America, within the quiet, studious halls of a university, an idea took root. It was not an idea born of malice, but of a colder, more terrifying impulse, the detached curiosity of science untethered from compassion. It was an idea that saw human beings not as souls to be nurtured, but as variables to be manipulated. In 1939, this idea would blossom into a plan, a meticulously designed experiment aimed at discovering the origins of a flaw in human speech. To do so, it would select the most vulnerable subjects imaginable, children without parents, without advocates, without anyone to protect them from the sober, methodical application of psychological cruelty. How does the noble pursuit of knowledge become an act of profound harm? At what point does a researcher cross the invisible line separating inquiry from abuse? And what happens when an institution created to care for the helpless becomes the very instrument of their torment? This is the story of an experiment, so infamous its own creators buried it, a study that would remain a dark secret for over 60 years. It is the story of 22 children who became unwitting subjects in a quest for answers, and of the 6 who were chosen for a special kind of lesson. They were to be taught that they were broken systematically and deliberately to see if the lesson would stick. The final tally of suffering, the lifelong echoes of a few months of calculated critique, would prove that it did. The genesis of this nightmare began not in a laboratory but in the mind of one man, Dr. Wendell Johnson. Johnson was not a monster. He was a pioneer in the field of speech pathology at the University of Iowa, a respected academic and a man haunted by a personal demon. From a young age, Johnson had been afflicted with a severe stutter, a constant, humiliating impediment that shaped his entire existence. It was a source of deep personal pain, but also the wellspring of a powerful intellectual obsession. He dedicated his life to understanding the mechanics of this affliction, convinced that its origins were not physiological, but psychological. He theorized that stuttering was not a condition one was born with, but a behavior learned through social anxiety and negative reinforcement, a diagnosis he termed diagnosogenic. A child, he believed, began to stutter because they were told they stuttered. It was a radical, compelling idea, and he was desperate to prove it. To test such a theory, he needed a controlled environment, a place with a supply of subjects who could be observed and manipulated over time without outside interference. He found it 90 miles east of the university in the city of Davenport. There stood the Iowa Soldiers Orphans Home, a sprawling brick institution that housed hundreds of children of the state. It was a world unto itself, governed by its own rules and routines. To the outside world, it was a sanctuary. To Wendell Johnson, it was a perfect laboratory. The children were wards of the state, their lives documented in neat files. They had no parents to ask difficult questions, no one to challenge the authority of a distinguished professor from the state university. They were, in the cold calculus of research, an ideal sample population, isolated and powerless. The very place meant to be their refuge was chosen for its strategic value as a site of experimentation. The first signs of the coming horror were not written in blood, but in the dry academic prose of a research proposal. Johnson designed the experiment, but its execution fell to one of his graduate students, a 22-year-old named Mary Tudor. Her master's thesis would be the vessel for his theory. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and chilling in its implications. Tudor would select 22 children from the orphanage and divide them into 2 main groups. One group consisted of children who were already identified by staff as stutterers. The other, the crucial group, consisted of children with perfectly normal, fluent speech. Each of these groups was then subdivided. Half of the stuttering children would be praised, their speech affirmed and encouraged. This was Group IA. The other half, Group IB, would be told their speech was poor and that they must work to correct it. The truly monstrous component of the study, however, lay with the normally fluent children. Group IIB would serve as the control, receiving no particular feedback. But Group IA, composed of 6 perfectly healthy children, was designated as the experimental group. They were the blank slates upon which Johnson's theory would be tested. Mary Tudor's task was to convince them that they stuttered. The enabling conditions for such an experiment were woven into the very fabric of the era. The 1930s were a different time in the world of science. The concept of informed consent was in its infancy, and the Nuremberg Code that would later establish ethical boundaries for human experimentation was still years away, a lesson yet to be learned from the ashes of a world war. Institutional authority, especially that of a university academic, was rarely questioned. Society held a different view of orphans, often seeing them less as individual children and more as a collective problem to be managed by the state. They were a resource, available for studies that could benefit the wider population. The orphanage's administration, likely believing they were contributing to important scientific progress, granted Johnson and Tudor unrestricted access. The system designed to protect these children inadvertently became the primary enabler of their abuse. It was a perfect storm of unchecked authority, scientific hubris, and a societal blind spot that rendered the most vulnerable invisible. Beginning in January of 1939, the pattern emerged. Mary Tudor became a regular visitor to the orphanage, a friendly young woman from the university who came to play games and talk with the children. Her visits, however, followed a rigid, predetermined script. For 5 months, she met with the children individually, reinforcing the assigned psychological conditioning. The sessions were the engine of the experiment, a systematic, repetitive process of either building up or tearing down a child's confidence. For the children in the positive therapy groups, her visits were a source of encouragement and praise. But for those in the negative groups, her arrival signaled another session of scrutiny and criticism. The horror was not in a single violent act, but in the relentless, methodical accumulation of small, corrosive moments. The machinery of evil was deceptively simple. It required no complex equipment, no scalpels or electrodes. Its only tools were words. For the 6 children in Group 2IA, the ones with normal speech, Tudor's methodology was precise and devastating. She would listen to them speak and then, with the calm authority of an expert, deliver the diagnosis. "The staff has come to the conclusion that you have a great deal of trouble with your speech," she would say. She would tell them they were showing all the signs of a stutterer. She instructed them, "Do not speak unless you can do it right." She told them to be conscious of their every utterance, to stop and start over if they thought they were making a mistake. She transformed the natural, effortless act of speaking into a minefield of potential failure. The children's files, meticulously kept by Tudor, document the clinical application of this psychological poison. Every hesitation, every normal childhood disfluency was recorded and presented back to the child as evidence of their supposed defect. The psychological landscape of the perpetrators was a complex terrain of ambition, rationalization, and perhaps willful blindness. Wendell Johnson, the architect, remained at the university, insulated from the direct emotional fallout of his creation. His own lifelong struggle with stuttering provided a powerful justification. In his mind, the potential benefit, proving that stuttering was a preventable, learned behavior, outweighed the temporary discomfort of a few orphan children. This was research that could alleviate the suffering of millions. It was a classic utilitarian argument, weighing a greater good against a lesser harm. For Mary Tudor, the young graduate student on the front lines, the situation was more fraught. She was an instrument of her mentor's will, following a protocol she likely felt she could not question. Yet the emotional toll of her work is hinted at in her later actions. She was compartmentalizing, performing the duties of a detached scientist during her sessions, while the human cost of her work accumulated just beneath the surface. It was a psychological state sustained by the powerful ideology of scientific progress, a belief that knowledge is always a worthy goal, regardless of the path taken to acquire it. There were no dramatic near discoveries, no moments where an outside investigator almost blew the case open. The experiment was too well contained, its nature too subtle for casual observation. The what-if moments were quieter, more tragic. What if a particular caregiver at the orphanage had noticed the growing silence and anxiety of the children in Group 2A and had possessed the courage to challenge the researchers? What if they had connected the dots between tutors' visits and the children's increasing distress? But the staff were likely overworked, managing hundreds of children, and the changes in the children becoming more withdrawn, hesitant to speak, could easily be misinterpreted as simple shyness or behavioral problems. The authority of the university researchers provided a powerful shield against scrutiny. Any concerns would have been easily dismissed as unscientific, anecdotal observations. The truth never surfaced because no one with the power to act was looking for it, and the children themselves lacked the words or the agency to report what was being done to them. The horror was happening in plain sight, hidden behind the veneer of legitimate research. The zenith of the horror unfolded over that winter and spring of 1939. During this period, the experiment was operating at its peak efficiency. The psychological assault was consistent and unrelenting. Mary Tudor's own logbooks, intended as objective scientific records, became an unintentional chronicle of induced trauma. She noted the immediate and disturbing effects on the children of Group 2A. A once talkative 5-year-old girl became reluctant to speak, covering her mouth with her hands. A boy began refusing to recite in class, overwhelmed with anxiety. Another started exhibiting the very stuttering behaviors, the tense repetitions, the blocks, the secondary physical tics that the experiment was designed to induce. The hypothesis was being proven correct. Wendell Johnson's theory was validated through the successful fracturing of healthy children's speech and self-esteem. The dual existence was stark. At the University of Iowa, it was a data-gathering exercise for a master's thesis. At the orphanage in Davenport, it was a season of escalating fear and confusion for a handful of children. The invisible victims were not anonymous data points. They were children with names and personalities. There was Hazel, a 5-year-old who, according to Tudor's notes, became much more conscious of herself and began to ask, "Why do I talk that way?" There was Clarence, aged 11, who grew reticent and shy and refused to speak in class. And there was Mary, a 12-year-old who became very self-conscious and began to interject and substitute words to avoid those she feared she would stumble on. Before the study, these children were described as normal, well-adjusted speakers. The experiment selected them for their fluency and then systematically dismantled it. The statistical accounting is chilling. Of the 6 children in Group 2IA, 5 showed a significant deterioration in their speech. Their fluency scores plummeted. They developed anxieties and avoidance behaviors. The experiment had taken something whole and deliberately broken it, leaving behind a permanent psychological scar. These were not just subjects. They were young lives irrevocably altered in the name of science. Society looked away because it was never asked to look. The experiment was conducted within the closed loop of the university and the orphanage, 2 institutions that operated with a significant degree of autonomy and public trust. The University of Iowa, a respected center of learning, provided the intellectual justification. The Iowa Soldiers Orphans Home, a state-run facility, provided the subjects. There was no external oversight committee, no ethics board as we know them today, to question the methodology. The state officials responsible for the orphanage placed their trust in the experts from the university. The uncomfortable truth is that the system worked exactly as it was designed. It was a system that prioritized scientific advancement over the welfare of its most powerless wards. The silence was not the result of a grand conspiracy, but of a collective, systemic failure of imagination and empathy. No one looked because it never occurred to them that they needed to. The authority of science was absolute, and the children were disposable. The first cracks in the wall of silence appeared not from the outside, but from within. The experiment concluded in May 1939, and Mary Tudor submitted her thesis. But she was clearly troubled by what she had done. She returned to the orphanage on her own initiative at least 3 times, attempting to conduct remedial therapy on the children she had harmed. She tried to reverse the conditioning, telling the children that their speech was fine, praising their fluency. Her efforts were largely unsuccessful. The psychological damage was already done. This was the first internal pressure, the conscience of the experiment's sole executioner. A more significant pressure came from Wendell Johnson himself. He recognized the incendiary nature of his findings. Proving that stuttering could be induced in healthy children by negative labeling was a monumental discovery, but the method used to obtain it was ethically indefensible. Publishing the study would have invited a firestorm of criticism and destroyed his reputation. So he made a choice. He buried it. The monster study, as it would later be nicknamed by his peers who heard rumors of it, was never submitted to a peer-reviewed journal. It was hidden away, a guilty secret in a university archive. For decades, there were no external pressures. The children of Group Douillet grew up, left the orphanage, and moved on with their lives, carrying with them the unexplained anxieties and speech difficulties that had begun in 1939. They had no idea that they had been the subjects of an experiment. The study remained a footnote in a bound thesis, a ghost story whispered in the halls of the university's speech pathology department. The pressure finally began to build nearly 60 years later, driven by the slow, inexorable power of investigative journalism. A reporter for the San Jose Mercury News, intrigued by rumors of the unethical study, began digging. He tracked down Mary Tudor, then in her 80s, and some of the surviving orphans. He found the thesis in the university library. The pieces of the puzzle, scattered for half a century, were finally being assembled. The breakthrough came in 2001 with the publication of the reporter's findings. The story of the monster study was finally told to the world, splashed across the pages of a major newspaper. It was a bombshell. The article gave a name and a cause to the lifelong struggles of the surviving subjects. It detailed the cold methodology and the devastating results. For the first time, the orphans understood what had happened to them in that winter of 1939. They learned that their insecurities, their struggles with speech, their fear of public speaking were not personal failings, but the direct intended outcomes of a university experiment. The academic secret had become a public scandal. The university's carefully guarded silence was shattered, and the denial that had protected the institution for decades became impossible to maintain. The revelation was a journalistic raid on a buried history. There was no physical crime scene to unseal, but the reporter's investigation served the same purpose. The primary evidence was Mary Tudor's thesis, a 60-year-old document that laid out the crime in meticulous academic detail. It was the perpetrator's own confession, preserved on the library shelf. Investigators and lawyers descended on the story, recovering the orphanage records, cross-referencing names and tracking down the survivors. The initial public reaction was one of shock and revulsion. The idea that a university would deliberately inflict psychological harm on orphaned children for the sake of research struck a raw nerve. The University of Iowa, caught in the glare of national media attention, was forced to confront a dark chapter in its past that it had long ignored. The sensory details were not of a physical crime, but of a moral one. The chilling, dispassionate language of the thesis, the quiet, lifelong pain in the voices of the elderly survivors, and the overwhelming evidence of a profound ethical breach. The accounting was forensic in its own way. It involved piecing together the fragments of shattered lives. The surviving orphans, now in their 70s, gave depositions, their testimonies forming a powerful mosaic of the study's long-term impact. They spoke of careers limited by a fear of speaking, of social anxieties, and of a persistent feeling of being somehow defective, a feeling that had been deliberately implanted in them as children. Mary Tudor's notes provided the cold, hard data, cataloging the children's descent from fluency into fearful silence. The psychological profiles of the perpetrators were also scrutinized. Johnson, long dead, could not answer for his actions, but his legacy was forever tarnished. Tudor, in her interviews, expressed profound regret, admitting the experiment was a mistake and that it had troubled her for her entire life. Her remorse, however genuine, could not undo the damage. There would be no criminal trial. Wendell Johnson had died in 1965, and the statute of limitations had expired decades earlier. The reckoning, when it came, took a different form. It was a legal and moral judgment. In 2001, in the face of overwhelming public pressure, the University of Iowa issued a formal public apology for the monster study, calling it regrettable and indefensible. But an apology was not enough for the survivors. 3 of them filed a lawsuit against the university and the state of Iowa, seeking compensation for a lifetime of harm. The legal battle was protracted, but in 2007, the state of Iowa agreed to a settlement paying a total of $925,000 to the surviving subjects and their estates. It was a landmark moment, a formal financial admission of responsibility. It was not justice in the traditional sense, no one went to jail, but it was an acknowledgement, a final official validation of the victim's suffering, measured not against the scale of the horror, but by the cold calculus of legal liability. The aftermath for the survivors and their families was a complex mixture of vindication and unresolved trauma. The settlement brought a measure of financial relief and, more importantly, a public acknowledgement that their struggles were real and had been caused by others. Marion Rowe, one of the key subjects from Group 2IA, spoke of how the lawsuit allowed her to finally understand that her lifelong speech anxieties were not her fault. The money, however, could not erase 60 years of psychological conditioning. It could not restore lost confidence or give back opportunities missed due to a fear of speaking. For the families of the victims who had already passed away, the settlement was a posthumous recognition of their loved ones' hidden pain. The survivors, through their legal fight, had transformed from passive victims into powerful witnesses, ensuring their story would not be forgotten. The primary cover-up was one of omission, not commission. Wendell Johnson's decision to not publish the study was a deliberate act of burial. He built a stellar career as a leading authority on stuttering, founding the American Speech and Hearing Association, all while the data from his most audacious experiment gathered dust. His theory that stuttering was diagnosogenic became widely influential, but he never cited the study that provided its most potent, albeit unethical, proof. The University of Iowa was complicit in this silence. For decades, the thesis sat in its library, known to a small circle of academics but never subjected to institutional review or public reckoning. The failure was systemic. It was a failure to police its own ethical boundaries, a failure to prioritize the welfare of research subjects, and a failure to confront its own history until forced to by external media pressure. The long battle to force an apology and a settlement was a fight against institutional inertia and the instinct to protect a reputation over acknowledging a wrong. The cultural legacy of the monster study is profound and enduring. It has become a canonical case study in university ethics courses around the world. a stark and unforgettable example of what can happen when scientific ambition is divorced from morality. It is held up alongside the Tuskegee syphilis study and the Milgram obedience experiments as a cautionary tale about the abuse of power in research. The story has been the subject of books, documentaries, and academic articles, its narrative serving as a permanent warning about the vulnerability of institutionalized populations and the absolute necessity for robust, independent oversight of all human experimentation. The study played a direct role in strengthening the regulations that govern research, particularly the role of institutional review boards and IRBs, which are now required to approve and monitor studies involving human subjects. Its transformation into a mythic tale of scientific evil ensures that the lessons learned from the suffering of 6 children will not be easily forgotten. So what does this story reveal about us? It shows the terrifying ease with which good intentions, like Wendell Johnson's desire to cure stuttering, can become the justification for monstrous acts. It exposes the fragility of ethical safeguards when confronted with the combined power of institutional authority and scientific ambition. The warning signs were not ignored. They were never even raised. The system failed to see the children as children, viewing them instead as a means to an end. We owe it to the memory of Marion, Hazel, Clarence, and the others to remember their names, to see them as the individuals they were before they became data. Their story forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. Have we truly learned the lesson? In our own modern pursuit of knowledge in medicine, technology, and social science, are we vigilant enough to protect the vulnerable? Or are we still at risk of creating new monsters in the quiet, respectable halls of progress? The legacy of the monster study is not just a historical record, it is a standing warning. It is a reminder that the first duty of science is not the discovery of truth, but the preservation of humanity.